The morning Darnell Webb sold his father's watch, he drove to the pawn shop with both hands tight on the wheel and his jaw set the way it always was when he had already made a decision and did not want anyone to unmake it for him. He had been running the soup kitchen on Clement Street for 11 years. 11 years of 6-day weeks of scrubbing industrial pots at 10 o'clock at night, of driving to restaurant back doors in the cold to ask if they had yesterday's bread they could spare. 11 years of smiling at men and women who shuffled in out of the rain and sat down at the folding tables and did not meet anyone's eyes because looking up too long in a place like that reminded you that you needed it. He had learned to love those people without making them feel loved in a way that required them to receive it. That was its own kind of skill, one that took years to develop and that no one would ever write down in a curriculum anywhere. He had never taken a salary, not $1. The kitchen ran on donations, on a small city grant that kept getting cut, and on whatever Darnell could piece together from his own check. His regular job was maintenance supervisor at an apartment complex on the west side, $36,000 a year, and he had learned to live on 22 of it so the rest could go where it needed to go. This had not been a sacrifice in the way people imagined when he briefly mentioned it to them. It had simply become the shape of his life, the same way your body adjusts to the weight you carry long enough. His name was not on any building. There was no sign that said who had kept the lights on for 11 years. Most of the people who ate at the kitchen on Clement Street did not know his last name. They called him D, or they called him Coach, which was a holdover from the years he had run a youth basketball league in the same neighborhood before the funding dried up. He answered to both. He did not correct anyone. He didn't need to be known to do the work. He had understood this about himself a long time ago, and it had freed him in a way he was not sure he could have explained to someone who still needed to be seen in order to keep going. The watch had been his father's. A Seiko, silver-faced with a small crack in the crystal that his father had never gotten fixed because he said it did not affect the time. His father had been a postal worker for 31 years and had worn that watch on every single shift, through summer routes and winter routes and routes that took him into parts of the city that people with a choice might have avoided. His father believed that showing up was a form of love, and that love required its objects. That watch had kept time for 31 years of showing up. It was the one thing Darnell had kept after the funeral 12 years ago now, and he had worn it himself every day since. When he put it on in the morning, he did not think about it anymore. It was as much a part of his daily body as his left hand. He got $340 for it at the pawn shop on Ridgeway Avenue. The man behind the counter offered $250 first, and Darnell did not say anything, just looked at the watch lying there on the glass case with the fluorescent light making it look smaller than it was, and the man came up to $340 without being asked. Darnell took the cash and folded it into his shirt pocket and walked out without looking back, because if he had looked back at the watch sitting on the glass counter under that light, he was not sure he would have kept walking. He sat in his car for a moment in the parking lot. He let the moment be what it was. Then he drove to the gas company office and paid the bill. The $340 covered the kitchen's gas bill for the month. Just the gas bill, nothing else. He had been 2 months behind on the electric since January. His volunteer cook, a woman named Patrice, who had been coming in 3 mornings a week for 9 years, had started quietly buying the spice packets herself, the onion powder and the cumin and the garlic salt, because she had noticed they were running low, and Darnell had stopped restocking them. She bought them at the discount grocery store on 5th and brought them in her canvas bag and put them on the shelf without saying anything, without leaving a note, without doing anything at all that would require Darnell to notice and feel the weight of being noticed. He did notice. He noticed and said nothing, the same way she had bought and said nothing. That was how they managed the gaps between them, in the language of small, unremarked acts, and it worked because both of them understood the language without having been taught it. If you have ever watched someone carry something heavy for a long time without putting it down, just to spare the people around them from having to see the weight, then you already know who he was. Some people need the weight to be seen to keep carrying it. Darnell was the other kind. He carried it best when nobody was looking. He opened the kitchen that Monday morning the same way he opened it every morning. He unlocked the steel door at 7, turned on the overhead fluorescence, started the first pot of coffee, and stood at the prep counter for a moment in the quiet before anyone arrived. The kitchen smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the faint sweetness of the cornbread they had made on Saturday. He stood in that smell for a few seconds the way some people stand in a church before the service starts. Not praying exactly, just being present in the place before the day required anything of him. Patrice had left the cornbread on the counter in a foil tray with a dish towel over it. He lifted the dish towel and looked at the cornbread and put the towel back down and went to check the rice. 83 people came through the door that day. He counted the way he always counted on a notepad he kept by the door on a nail. 83. A retired school bus driver named Harold who came every Tuesday and Thursday and always thanked Darnell by shaking his hand with both of his, pressing both his palms around Darnell's right hand and holding it for a second before letting go. A young woman with a sleeping infant in a carrier who sat in the corner and ate quickly and left before anyone could speak to her, her eyes down and her movements careful, the particular carefulness of someone who has learned that public space is not always safe for her. A man named Curtis who had been coming for 7 years and who had found a part-time job 6 months ago and who now sometimes arrived early and helped set out the folding chairs, though he always filled a plate before he left because the kitchen had been part of his life for long enough that leaving it entirely would have been its own kind of loss. 83 people on a Monday morning, and Darnell knew something particular about most of them. He knew Harold's granddaughter was at the community college, and he knew Curtis had been trying to get his driver's license reinstated, and he knew Patrice's mother was sick in Savannah, and he knew all of this not because he had asked, but because people told you things when you fed them regularly and did not look at them with pity. Darnell had not told anyone about the watch. What he did not know on that Monday morning while he stood in the quiet kitchen before opening and breathed in the smell of cornbread and industrial cleaner was that 4 days before a man had walked past the soup kitchen on Clement Street on a Thursday evening and stopped on the sidewalk outside. The man's name was Leonard Holt. He was 61 years old, recently retired from a logistics company he had built over 28 years from a single delivery truck to a regional fleet of 43 vehicles and a warehouse in 3 states. Leonard had started the company with $11,000 he had saved from a decade of working other people's routes, and he had never once forgotten what it felt like to load a truck in the dark at 4 in the morning and not be certain the load would lead anywhere. He had sold the company 14 months ago for a sum that had appeared in a trade journal but that he did not bring up in conversation. He had been walking the city in the evening since the sale closed because he found that motion helped him think, and that he had more time to think now than he was comfortable with. He had stopped outside the kitchen on Clement Street because a man was mopping the public sidewalk at 7:30 in the evening. Not the floor inside the building, the concrete sidewalk out front, the city's sidewalk, the one nobody had asked him to clean. He was mopping it with a push mop in a grey sweatshirt with the hood down, working in long, even strokes, covering the whole width from the building front to the curb. He had a bucket beside him and he rinsed the mop without any drama and kept going. He was mopping it the way you mop something when you intend for it to actually be clean. Not for appearance, not because anyone would grade the results. Leonard had stood on the opposite side of the street in the mild evening and watched for 2 full minutes. Then he walked on. He came back the next evening. He crossed the street this time and stood on the sidewalk, the same sidewalk that had been mopped the night before, and he could see through the lit window a man inside washing dishes at a large institutional sink. Same sweatshirt. Working the same way, efficient and unhurried. Leonard stood there until the man looked up, and they held a look for half a second across the window glass. And then Leonard nodded and walked on. Leonard had grown up in a neighbourhood 4 miles east of Clement Street, and he had eaten at a place very much like this one, twice a week for most of a winter, when he was 9 years old, and his mother was between jobs and the heat in their apartment had been shut off. He had not told people that story, not publicly, not in the interviews he had given when the company was doing well and reporters wanted origin stories. He had kept it private not because he was ashamed of it, but because it felt like something that belonged to him and his mother and the kitchen that had fed them, and he did not want to turn it into a parable about himself. He carried it differently from that. He carried it as a debt that he had never found the right place to repay. He did not go in on the second evening. He stood on the mopped sidewalk and watched the man wash dishes and walked on. What he did that night, sitting at the small desk in his hotel room because he had not yet committed to an apartment since selling the house that went with the company, was look up the soup kitchen on Clement Street. He found a spare website that had not been updated in over a year. He found a donation button that linked to a PayPal account. He found a single grainy photograph of a man in a grey sweatshirt standing in front of folding tables with people seated at them, everyone slightly blurred, the photo taken from a slight distance as if the photographer had not wanted to intrude. There was no annual report. There was no list of board members or funders or institutional partners. There was no organizational history beyond a single paragraph that said the kitchen had been founded in 2013 and served the surrounding community 6 days a week. There was a phone number at the bottom of the page. Leonard looked at that phone number for a while. He wrote it down on the hotel notepad and put it on the desk and went to bed. He picked up the notepad in the morning and looked at it again. He set it back down and went for his walk. Meanwhile, Darnell did not know any of this. He did not know a man had watched him mop the sidewalk from across the street and come back the next evening. He didn't know someone had found the website that his friend Marcus had built for free 3 years ago and never had the time to update. He did not know his phone number was sitting on a hotel notepad being looked at and set back down. He was troubleshooting a refrigeration seal in the walk-in cooler that had started leaking at one corner, searching online for replacement parts, calculating whether he could push it another 2 weeks or whether pushing it would cost him the whole unit. He called a supply company and got a quote and set the phone down and stared at the ceiling of the kitchen for a while. Patrice came in and saw his face and said, "What?" he said. "The walk-in seal," she said. "How bad?" He said, "Manageable," which was what he said about most things. She looked at him for a moment the way she had been looking at him for 9 years when she could tell he was managing something he was calling manageable. She didn't push. She went to start the coffee and left him to his ceiling. On Friday morning, Darnell's phone rang at 8:45. He was portioning cooked rice into individual containers with a large spoon, working through the rhythm of it, container after container, which was meditative in the way that simple, repetitive tasks become meditative when you have been doing them long enough. He almost did not answer the number he did not recognize. He answered it. The man introduced himself as Leonard Holt. He said he had walked by the kitchen earlier in the week. He said he had a few questions if Darnell had a few minutes. Darnell did not have a few minutes. He had 4 volunteers arriving in 20 minutes and 80-some people arriving an hour after that, and a refrigeration problem and a portioning job half done. He said he had a few minutes. What followed was not the kind of conversation Darnell had developed a posture for over the years. The calls from city contacts about reporting metrics and outcome measurements, the foundation intake interviews where you had to translate the daily fact of feeding people into language that fit a logic model. Leonard asked how long the kitchen had been open. He asked how many people came through on an average week. He asked what Darnell's single biggest operational challenge was right now, this specific week. He asked that last question the way someone asks it when they actually want to know the answer and have worked in operations long enough to understand that the real state of a thing is always in the current week's problem, not the mission statement. Darnell told him about the walk-in seal. He told him about the electric bill. He was not certain why he told him about the electric bill. He generally did not tell strangers about the gaps. He told his volunteers things when they needed to know them, and he told Patrice things when they were unavoidable, and he absorbed everything else himself. Telling a stranger on a Friday morning about the electric bill was not something he did. He did it anyway. Leonard asked if Darnell had time on Sunday afternoon. Darnell had not taken a Sunday afternoon off in over 4 years. He said he could move some things. They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the kitchen. Leonard arrived 5 minutes before Darnell and had already ordered coffee for both of them and left Darnell's at the seat across from him, which was the kind of small logistical attention that told you something about how a person moved through the world. They sat across from each other in the window booth and talked for an hour and 45 minutes. Leonard asked about the neighborhood, the history of the block, the relationship with the city grant office, the volunteer structure, whether Darnell had considered any kind of apprenticeship program for some of the regulars who showed aptitude. He was not performing interest, he was mapping something. Darnell had sat across from enough people in his life to know the difference between someone working through a checklist and someone building an actual picture. At the end of the conversation, Leonard set down his coffee cup and said, "I should tell you something before we go any further." He said, "I grew up eating in a place exactly like yours." He said it plainly, without ceremony. He said, "I was 9. My mother was between jobs. We did not have heat that winter." He said, "I did not talk about it publicly for a long time. I am telling you now because I think it matters that you know who you are actually talking to." Darnell looked at him across the table. Leonard said, "I want to help." He said, "I want to understand what help means here before I offer anything specific. I will call you in a week." Darnell drove home and parked in front of his building and sat in the car. He had learned over 11 years to be careful with hope. People said they would call, and mostly they meant it, and mostly they did not call, and that was not because they were bad people. It was because intention and follow-through are two different muscles, and most people exercised one and assumed it trained the other. He sat in the car for a while and then went inside and made rice and beans for dinner and went to bed. He kept opening the kitchen every morning that week. He portioned and served and counted on the notepad and smiled at Harold and watched Curtis show up early on Wednesday. He fixed the walk-in seal with a patch kit he ordered online and a YouTube video, and 2 hours on his knees in a cold space, which was not the permanent solution but would hold for another month. He tallied the electric bill and what was owed and set the paper down. On the 7th day after the coffee shop, a Thursday morning, Darnell was in the lot behind the kitchen carrying cases of day-old bread from the back of his hatchback. Bread a restaurant on the North End had set aside for him to collect. He heard the truck before he saw it, a flatbed, the kind used for freight delivery, turning onto Clement Street from the corner. It pulled to the curb in front of the kitchen. The driver climbed down with a clipboard. He asked if this was the kitchen on Clement Street. Darnell said it was. The driver said he had a delivery. He said it the same way drivers say everything, with complete professional neutrality, as if there were nothing unusual about a fully loaded flatbed arriving unannounced on a Thursday morning. Darnell called 2 volunteers who happened to be nearby, and the 4 of them spent 40 minutes unloading. Canned goods in cases, the kinds of staples that ran out fastest, beans and tomatoes and corn and broth, 50-pound bags of dried pinto beans, black beans, rice, cornmeal, rolled oats, commercial cooking oil in large containers, industrial cleaning supplies, dish soap, bleach, the things that you went through invisibly and that cost more than people thought. Paper goods, trays and napkins, and the kind of disposable containers the kitchen used for takeout portions for people who came by outside meal hours. At the back of the truck, wrapped carefully in moving blankets, a commercial walk-in refrigeration unit, second-hand but recently reconditioned, with a service tag indicating it had been inspected 2 weeks prior. The driver handed Darnell a separate sheet that said installation was scheduled for the following Monday, 8 in the morning. There was nothing on the truck from Leonard directly. The delivery manifest listed a logistics company in the header that Darnell recognized from when Leonard had mentioned his former work. The truck pulled away, and Darnell stood on the sidewalk and looked at the stacked supplies and at the refrigeration unit waiting on the curb for Monday, and at Amara, one of his Thursday volunteers, who was standing next to him with her hands in her jacket pockets. She said, "Is this good?" He said, "Yes." He said, "This is very good." He said it twice quietly, as if he was still deciding whether to believe it. He did not let himself feel the full weight of it until that evening, after the dinner service, after the volunteers had left, and Patrice had gone home and the last pot was clean, and he was the only one in the building. He was drying a tray at the large sink, and the overhead lights were buzzing the way they always buzzed at the end of the day, and the quiet had settled in. And he stood there and felt the full weight of the week press against the fact of what had arrived on that truck, and his eyes went wet. He stood at the sink and let it happen, and breathed through it, and then dried his hands on his apron and turned off the lights. He called Leonard that evening. Leonard picked up on the second ring. Darnell said, "The truck came." He did not say anything else for a moment because that was actually the sentence, the whole of it. Leonard said he was glad it arrived safely. He said, "I should have told you it was coming. I should not have just sent a truck without calling you first." Darnell said it was fine. He said, "I need to ask you something." Leonard said, "Go ahead." Darnell said, "Why?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that is not hesitation, but consideration. Leonard said, "I told you about the winter I was 9 years old." He said, "I have had money for long enough to do something about that debt, and I kept finding reasons to do it later, through another vehicle, a fund, a grant mechanism, something with a structure around it." He said, "I walked past your window on a Thursday evening and watched you mop a sidewalk that did not belong to you, and I stopped finding reasons to wait." Darnell was quiet for a moment. He said, "My father used to say the right thing done late is still the right thing." Leonard said, "Your father sounds like someone worth listening to." Darnell said he was. That was the extent of it that night. They talked for a few more minutes about the installation Monday, about the supply inventory, about what a longer-term arrangement might look like when they had time to sit down together. Then they said goodnight, and Darnell drove home under a sky that had gone the particular deep blue that comes right before full dark in October. It was 2 weeks after the truck that Darnell told Leonard about the watch. They were sitting at one of the kitchen's folding tables on a Sunday afternoon, going through a simple accounting of what the kitchen needed month to month versus what it had been managing on. Leonard had brought coffee, which was becoming a pattern between them. They were talking about the walk-in installation and the electric account, and what a stable operational fund might look like as a structure. And at a certain point in the conversation, in the particular ease that had developed between two people who have decided to be honest with each other, Darnell mentioned the watch. He said, "The week before you called, I sold my father's watch to pay the gas bill." Leonard put down his cup and looked at him. Darnell said, "It was a Seiko, silver face. There was a crack in the crystal that my father never had fixed because he said it did not affect the time. He wore it for 31 years on his postal route." Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he said Darnell's name in a particular way that made Darnell look at him. Leonard asked a few questions. The pawn shop on Ridgeway. The man behind the counter, whether the watch had been sold or was still on hold. He asked the questions carefully, the way someone asks when they are gathering specific information for a specific purpose and do not want to raise a hope that cannot be delivered. He made a phone call that afternoon. He made a second call the next morning. He had built a company on knowing how to move things from one place to another efficiently, and he applied that skill now in the service of one specific thing. 2 days later, a Saturday morning, Darnell arrived at the kitchen and found a small cardboard box sitting on the prep counter. He had not unlocked the back door yet, and he stood looking at the box for a moment. He opened it. Inside the box, on a square of tissue paper, was his father's watch, silver-faced, the small crack in the crystal catching the morning light. There was a folded piece of paper in the box, with 2 words in Leonard's handwriting. "Put it back on." Darnell stood at the prep counter, holding the box and the watch and the note. Patrice came in at her usual time and saw his face. She didn't ask. She set her bag down and went to start the coffee, and she let him stand there with whatever he was holding, the way she had been letting him stand with things for 9 years. The way you do when you know someone well enough to understand that the right kind of company is sometimes just presence without commentary. He put the watch on. He stood at the prep counter with his father's watch on his wrist. Its familiar weight returned to him, and he breathed. Outside, the street was just beginning to have traffic on it. The kitchen smelled like old coffee and clean floors. The doors opened at 8. There are people who do the right thing when it costs them something real, not because anyone is watching, not because there is a mechanism that will credit them for it, not because they have a surplus of goodness they can afford to spend without noticing. They do it because the alternative is to be a different kind of person, and they decided somewhere early, somewhere before the habit formed, that they would not be that kind. The cost tends to register in small private ways that no one around them sees. A watch sold on a Tuesday. A Sunday afternoon, not taken in 4 years. Spice packets bought quietly and shelved without a word. Those costs do not make the newspapers, they make the person. The partnership between Darnell and Leonard did not make the news. Neither of them tried for that. What it produced was a paid current electric bill and a functioning walk-in and a stocked kitchen and a modest operational reserve that Darnell could draw on for shortfalls without asking anyone's permission or filing a report. It produced also something for Leonard, something harder to account for in any ledger, the particular relief of a debt set down in the right place after a very long time. Darnell kept running the kitchen. He kept counting on the notepad. He kept standing in the quiet before opening. Harold kept coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays and holding his hand in both of his. Curtis kept arriving early and filling a plate before he left. Amara, the Thursday volunteer who had sat with Darnell on the curb the day the truck came, was now on Saturdays too, and she had learned Patrice's cornbread recipe after years of asking, and Patrice had finally written it down on a card and handed it over, like a deed. Leonard came in on a weeknight in December to help with dinner service. He wore a plain apron and he stood at the serving station and ladled soup and said, "Yes, ma'am, and yes, sir," to the people who came through the line. He was not awkward about it. He was simply there, doing the work, present in the place without requiring it to be about him. The young woman with the infant came through that evening. Her baby was 6 months older, awake and looking around with wide eyes at the lights. She sat at a table near the window and ate without rushing, and when Amara came with a second bowl, she looked up and said, "Thank you," quietly, with her eyes meeting Amara's for just a moment. Darnell noticed. He noticed from across the room, and then he went back to what he was doing. If this story moves something in you, leave it in the comments. Tell me about someone who kept going when it would have been easier to stop. That is the story that matters, and there are more of them out there than we say. And if you want to hear another one, there is one waiting for you at the end of this video. Someone else who did the quiet thing and found out later that it was seen. On a late evening in November of that year, Darnell stood on the sidewalk outside the kitchen after locking up. The air was cold, and the pavement was damp from rain earlier, and the streetlight made the wet concrete shine. He stood there with his keys in his hand the way he sometimes did, just for a moment, before getting in the car. He looked up the block and down the block. He had been looking at this particular stretch of street for 11 years. His father's watch was on his wrist. The small crack in the crystal caught the edge of the streetlight. He felt its weight, the familiar weight that had been missing for those weeks and that now felt like it had simply always been there. Some things, when they are returned to you, settle back into place so completely that the absence stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like something that happened to teach you a word you needed to know. He walked to his car and drove home through the November night, the city dark and bright around him, and somewhere on the west side a postal worker was setting out his gear for the morning route, and the kitchen on Clement Street was clean and stocked and cold enough in the walk-in, and the electric was paid, and Darnell Webb drove home wearing his father's watch, and the time it kept was exactly right. There were things about the kitchen that Darnell had never told anyone, things that were not secrets exactly, but that he had simply never found occasion to put into words. The way the first pot of coffee in the morning sounded different when the kitchen was empty from the way it sounded later when people were in the room. The sound the chairs made when volunteers set them out on the folding tables, a particular scraping percussion that he had heard so many times it had become a kind of music. The specific quality of silence that descended after the last person left and before he started washing the last things, a silence that felt inhabited even when the room was technically empty, as if the day's presence still lingered in the air for a few minutes before dispersing. Harold had once told Darnell on a Tuesday in March that coming to the kitchen gave him a reason to put his shoes on in the morning. He had said it simply, not fishing for anything, just as a statement of plain fact. Harold was 74 years old and had driven school buses for 32 years and had 3 grown children who lived in other cities and who called on birthdays and Christmas. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from Clement Street. Putting his shoes on meant something. Darnell had thought about that sentence for weeks. He still thought about it occasionally. That sentence was more of a justification for the 11 years than any metric he could have reported to any funder. Curtis had his own quiet story. 6 months after finding the part-time job at the hardware supply warehouse, he had come in one Thursday with 2 bags of oranges. He had set them on the counter without explanation and then helped serve the meal and eaten his plate and left. The next week there were oranges again. It became a thing. Curtis brought fruit when he could, not on any schedule, just when he happened to have something and happened to be coming. Nobody made a ceremony of it. The fruit appeared on the counter and went out with the meals, and that was the whole story. Except that it was not a small story at all when you understood what it cost Curtis to be on the giving side of that counter instead of the receiving side. That kind of turning was not nothing. Darnell knew it was not nothing. The young woman with the infant, whose name Darnell did not learn for 3 months, was named Vanessa. She had moved to the city 8 months before from a smaller town in the eastern part of the state, following a situation she did not discuss, and that the kitchen did not ask about, because the kitchen did not ask about things like that. She'd found a room in a shared apartment 2 miles away and a cashier job that gave her 22 hours a week and not enough to cover the room and the baby and also food, so she had started coming to the kitchen on Mondays. She had sat in the corner for the first 6 weeks because she was not yet certain of the room, not certain that it was the kind of place that would let her be exactly as she was, which was a young mother who was tired and a little scared and trying very hard and not especially willing to be an object of anybody's sympathy. She had worked that out on her own schedule. By December, she was sitting near the window. Darnell did not engineer any of this. He simply kept the kitchen open and kept the food warm and kept his face easy and let people arrive at their own pace. That was another thing 11 years had taught him. You could not make people feel safe. You could only make a place that was safe and keep making it and let the feeling come when it came. He thought about all of this on the evening after the watch was returned, standing in the kitchen after everyone had gone. He was at the sink with the last pot, working through the close-out routine that he had done so many times the steps had become automatic. The overhead lights were buzzing and the refrigeration unit was running smoothly in the walk-in, and the shelves were stocked in a way they had not been stocked in years, and the electric was paid. He stood at the sink and let himself feel all of it at once, the years of it, not as a weight this time, but as a length. 11 years was a long way to look back. From where he was standing now, he could see it all the way to the beginning. The beginning had been a folding table and a borrowed stock pot and 47 people on the first day, which was more than he had expected and which had terrified him in the most useful way. He had run out of soup by 1 in the afternoon and had apologized to the last 12 people in line and had stood on the sidewalk after they left and made himself a promise that he had kept. He had not run out since. There had been weeks when the last few portions were thin and he had stretched them further than was ideal, and there had been weeks when the donations had been short and he had supplemented from his own pocket without mentioning it. There had been a February when the pipes froze, and a summer when the city inspector found a ventilation issue, and a year when the city grant was cut by 40%, and he had absorbed the cut by working more hours at the apartment complex on the side and sleeping less. There had been all of those things, and he had not run out since the first day. He thought about his father on evenings like this. His father had retired from the postal service at 62 and died at 65, which was not enough years but was the years he had gotten. And he had used the postal years well, showing up every day in every kind of weather and learning the names of the people on his route and carrying the packages for people who couldn't carry them, and doing it without once making anyone feel they owed him anything for the carrying. His father had a particular gift for making service feel like company. Darnell had been trying to learn it his whole life. He wore the watch now the way you wear something that has been returned to you after an absence, consciously for the first few days, aware of it on his wrist in a way he had stopped being aware of it before the pawn shop, and then gradually the consciousness faded, and the weight became simply part of him again. The way it had always been, the way his father's things became part of Darnell, the same way his father's habits had become part of him. Slowly and without drama, the way inheritance actually works between people who pay attention to each other. Leonard came back on a Saturday in January. He came back quietly, the way he did things without announcement, and sat at one of the tables with a coffee he had brought from the shop on the corner and watched the morning service run. He watched Patrice manage the stove, and Amara manage the line, and Curtis set up the overflow chairs in the back when the tables filled. He watched Darnell move through the room the way Darnell had always moved through it, stopping at tables to speak to people, crouching down to talk to a child, refilling a cup without being asked. Leonard watched all of this with the particular attention of someone who had run operations long enough to understand that what he was watching was not chaos being managed, but a system that had been built so carefully over so long that it had become invisible, which is the highest form a system can achieve. After the service, when the room had cleared and Patrice was cleaning the stove and Amara was breaking down the stations, Leonard helped Darnell fold the chairs and stack them against the wall. They folded chairs in companionable silence for a while, the way people work together when they do not need conversation to make the work feel shared. Leonard said, "You built something real here," Darnell said. "People built it." He said it without false modesty. He said, "Harold comes because he wants to be useful. Curtis comes because this place was there for him when he needed it. Patrice comes because she is the kind of person who comes." He said, "I kept the lights on. They built it." Leonard looked at him for a moment. He said, "Keeping the lights on is not a small thing." Darnell said, "No," he said, "it is not." They stacked the last of the chairs. The kitchen was quiet in the way it was always quiet in the late morning after the service, a warm quiet, used and settled. Darnell put on his jacket to go check the back lot. As he was doing up the zipper, he glanced at the watch on his wrist. The silver face, the crack in the crystal, the second hand making its steady circuit. He had not thought about what it cost him to sell the watch in the weeks since it had come back. He had not rehearsed the price he had paid, or stacked it against what had arrived. That was not the way he kept account. The watch was back, and the kitchen was stocked, and the walk-in was cold, and the lights were on, and 80-some people had eaten that morning. And that was the ledger, as he understood it. There were people who kept a careful accounting of what sacrifice had cost them, who carried the cost the way you carry a receipt to prove you paid. Darnell was not that kind. He put the cost down when the thing it had bought was real. The thing it had bought was real. He went out to check the back lot. The morning was bright and cold. His breath made small clouds. The street was ordinary, and the buildings on either side were ordinary, and the Clement Street kitchen sat in the middle of all of it, its steel door closed, its sign modest and hand-painted. And inside it, on the shelves that Leonard's truck had stocked, were enough supplies to feed everyone who came through that door for a good while longer. Darnell stood in the cold for a moment and then went back inside. He had a kitchen to run,